In the growing world of Bigfoot and in the information age, there are so many questions to be had and not a whole lot of clear answers. So for tonight, we're bringing you all a brand new show. We're calling it Bigfoot for Beginners. And who are we? We are the Southeast Bigfoot Research Organization. My name's Jaster, and coming with me tonight is my co-founder and co-host, Kazari.
Yo.
And our newest member, Myth. How are you doing, bud?
Doing good. How you guys doing?
Oh, we're doing good, just chilling. So, we're going to go ahead and get into the structure of the show a little bit. But before we do that, like I said, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves and why we might be somewhat qualified to talk about this subject, okay? So, like I said, we are the Southeast Bigfoot Research Organization. We have been formally a group since 2025. However, me and Kaz have been researching this phenomenon for a combined, would you say 20 to 30 years now between the two of us?
Yeah. Oh, totally. Absolutely.
So, we've got a lot of know-how as far as written text records, newspaper reports, all that kind of stuff. We're looking at basically growing up in the phenomenon, okay? Both of us having Bigfoot encounters when we were younger that were both verified by adults in our lives that we didn't feel like were Bigfoot believers until that day. So, speaking for myself, I grew up in the woods ever since I was born. I moved over to Louisville about 10 years ago. However, the woods are basically a huge part of my life. I still like to hunt and fish, or really fish more often than not. However, there's a lot going on out there that people don't like to talk about. And one of the things that I've learned growing up in the woods and living in that life is that if you ask anybody who spends out enough time in there, they're going to say that they had seen something strange in their lifetime. But that's who I am. I'd like to do a lot of the audio analysis here at Cbro. I also do a lot of the main phone call work for everybody, doing interviews, that kind of thing. And I also like to get into historical records, government records, that kind of stuff. But that's enough about me. Let me go ahead and pass it to Kaz really quick so he can talk a little bit about his credentials before we go ahead and get into the show.
For me, my big moment that kind of changed everything and made it concrete was finding a Bigfoot track on a riverbank while on a camping trip with my classmates, and having the father of a friend verify it and kind of estimate how old it was, and all three of us being baffled about it. For me, when it comes to my skills, it's particularly seeking out testimonies, primarily written ones, literary analysis in regards to folklore, the gift of gab. For me, I really enjoy Sasquatch not only as a zoological mystery, but I also enjoy it as a social phenomenon. And I find the sociological aspects of it deeply fascinating. And so that's kind of my angle of research when I come at things.
For me, I'll say that this is all still really new. The biggest thing that drew me into this, honestly, was the most recent sightings here in Ohio, which really piqued the interest of not just myself, but a lot of different people. And luckily for me, I had the right people around me to ask questions and pick their brains, and also just to teach me how to look into what I'm looking for exactly when it comes to figuring out if this is real or not, if this is a potential reality that we live in where there are cryptids, where there are Bigfoot, where there are anything outside of the realm of what we can see. And so for the longest time, I will be the first to say I wouldn't say I was necessarily a skeptic, but I was kind of on an edge, teetering back and forth. Like one day I could believe it, believe that anything is possible. Another day I would wake up and I'd be like, maybe not in the sense of like what we visualize in our brains when we say the word Bigfoot. But since then, I have had a couple of different situations arise to where There was a likelihood of an encounter, so it has definitely piqued my interest and drawn me closer to the topic. And here we are today.
And hey, there's a lot of questions for all of us to still discuss and still try and figure out as a community. And so this is kind of what came about whenever we were all sitting here like, man, he's got a bunch of questions and we like to talk about them, but like we also feel like we needed to sit down and record this as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because like I feel like everybody starts this journey at some point, and there's a bunch of different places out there to get information. We just try to be the most information dense of those podcasts, and hopefully we still keep that moving forward. So let's go ahead and get the gab out of here. Let's go ahead and start Bigfoot for beginners. Okay, so how we're going to work this out is Miss going to ask a question. He's going to give a little bit of extra context if he needs to. And then it's going to go to Kaz. Then it's going to go to me. And then we're going to pass it back around with some reclarifying questions. And then we're going to move on to the next question. Okay? So if you've remembered the show before, back when it was Core Live, whenever we did our bigger episodes, that's how we tried to run it. And it worked out pretty good. So, Myth, you want to go ahead and kick us off with our first question of the night?
All right, this is what I've been waiting for. So, question one: what is the genuine origin of Bigfoot?
So, one of the first things that you need to be able to admit when you are researching something like Bigfoot is being able to say that you don't know. The fact of the matter is that part of the mystery of Sasquatch in general is that we don't know the nature of it and we don't know the origin of it. You know, you've kind of heard us before toss around phrases like relic hominid, missing ancestor, primate theory, you know, stuff like that. It's because the nature of the cryptid itself isn't necessarily agreed upon, simply because we have no solid body of evidence to really give us an idea. We have a lot of concepts and hypotheses that give us a loose framework of what we think Sasquatch is. But the problem is it's kind of like going to art museum and looking at like an impressionist painting. You know, you can sit there and you can tilt your head different ways, but everybody's gonna take a different meaning away from it. So, you know, there's no way of telling what the genuine origin is.
But I'll say we've got some good guesses. Okay, you want me to go ahead and go from here?
Sure.
All right. So, as far as the North American continent, because I like to break this question up into two different segments. Okay, New World and Old World, for lack of a better terminology. So, as far as the New World answer to the origin of Bigfoot, as far back as we can understand it, it goes back to oral traditions in Native American mythology. And that's kind of a big rub here. That's what Kaz is trying to get across, is that we don't have timelines for oral traditions because a lot of these cultures did not have a sophisticated timekeeping or bookkeeping and historical record. So, like, it's kind of hard to find it. Now, for a lot of people, if you were to answer this question, they would say that the Stahalish tribe and the Sasquatch would be the first mentioning of Bigfoot in North America. Now, because of their largely nomadic lifestyles, written records don't really exist, right? And we don't really get written records of wild men or of Bigfoot until around the 1800s in North America. And that's because colonial explorers came in, they started writing down papers to send back to Europe, right? Now, let's talk a little bit weirder real quick, because I like to do that. Whenever you look at Europe and mentions of old world records of Bigfoot-like creatures, okay, it goes back. Does anybody want to guess how far back? I think I talked about it with Kaz earlier, but Myth, what do you think the oldest mentioning of a Bigfoot-like creature in ancient human civilization is?
Okay, so don't kill me for this, but I'm gonna go as far back as like to say like the late 1800s.
Oh, bro, we're talking BCs here.
Ooh,
We're talking
okay.
BCs,
Oh
okay?
wait, Wait, hold on. Um, I think we talked about this briefly. Jesus. Then I don't really have a, a legitimate answer. I know there were paintings. There were paintings uh in biblical references
We are
like in accordance to what exactly you're referring to, I believe,
So
if I'm not
that's a
mistaken.
part of it, but that's technically like the 1600s, like right, like back when I
Okay.
can't remember exactly when they made those murals. I'll throw up the ones that we're talking about up here on the screen. That depicts essentially one of the demonic princes in a cave underneath the rest of the mural, right? And a lot of people can look at that thing and look at what's going on in there and be like, "Why is there's Bigfoots in a cave over there?" All right. And a lot of people have a legitimate reason of thinking that because why are they painting UFO like things on the top of chapels too, right? Plenty of weird things going on in the church. I don't know, maybe Michelangelo was like, they ain't gonna look up here and find it anyway. Screw it, we're gonna throw some weird stuff up here. Don't know. Possible. But that is one thing that keeps getting brought up is the hairy creatures in the cave on in the murals that go up on the chapels in old Europe, but that's not actually it. So the oldest one that I dug up, okay, was actually the Epic of Gilgamesh, okay? We're talking like the first written tale in human history actually has a hairy wildman of the woods, and it's Enkidu. Now, if you're familiar with Final Fantasy XIV or with any other modern recollections of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, it's mostly him as the chicken, right? That's how most people know him as the chicken companion. So that's not the original description for Enkidu. The original description was an uncivilized animal-like human covered in hair and raised in the wild. And from what I understand, he wasn't really well understood. He was more understood by Gilgamesh than anybody else. Now, that's crazy, all right? But it keeps going far. That keeps going, all right? So when you get into the medieval era, we get into the 1600s and all that kind of European folklore, it starts to get all over the place, okay? Because you also have a creature called the Woodwoes, which was a forest spirit that represented untamed nature, strength, and chaos. There's also the Slavic Leshy, which was a spirit that can shapeshift, but mostly chooses to show itself as a hairy wild man. Now, most of these European records of hairy wild men started showing up in historical records around the 12th century, but that also persisted quite a bit onwards after that. Now, I don't know what the exact reason for the first mentioning of it in the 12th century, but I didn't look that far into it. So, I'll go ahead and pass it back to Myth. All right, you got any questions? You got any extra points you want to point out or want to bring up on that?
For this current question, no, I do not. I am excited to continue this onslaught of questionnaires.
All right, next one.
All right, question two, ladies and gentlemen. Why is it that Bigfoot encounters are so far and in between one another?
All right. So let's step away from Bigfoot for a moment and let's talk about bears, okay? Bears are a reclusive animal. They don't really like contacting people all that much. Obviously, most animals really won't go toward people unless there's a food motivation as such as running out of prey. But especially bears, they prefer to hunt and scavenge and kind of do their own thing in their territory. And while they might wander into like a human encampment or maybe a neighborhood because of encroachment on territory, for the most part they like to stick to themselves, right? Okay, now think about how many times have you seen a bear in your life outside of captivity? Really, really think about that, and think about the circumstances that had to line up for that to happen. Okay, you had to be somewhere in nature inside of a bear's territory where they were in the middle of searching for some kind of food or something, and you came across them, whether it be a grizzly or a black bear or whatever. Okay, now think about how many bear encounters people have every year. Okay, it's not really a big number. I think I would put it somewhere maybe This is a really generous guesstimate. It's probably less than this. Somewhere around 10,000. Editing Jaster, put up an actual statistic here for me.
Gotcha.
Now, let's take that and let's apply that to a big ape. Okay? A big ape that has more or less the same dietary habits, probably. So obviously, if you don't want to be seen, you're not going to be near any settlements. It'll be deep in the woods for those easy routes of escape, and plenty of resources for you to draw from. Realistically, it's just like encountering big animals in the woods. If you want me to get into more technical reasons why Sasquatch sightings are so sparse and isolated, there's a couple of things going on. So the first one is the sociological aspect of it. It is a fantastic thing to see, but there are a lot of people who immediately worry about ruining their own credibility or status by saying they saw one. So there's a chance when somebody sees one that it won't go reported. And this does actually have a little bit of an effect on, the data that exists out there, because for every encounter that is reported and investigated, there's about 10 to 20 more that have been reported and have not been investigated, and then probably just as many that were not reported and we don't know about at all.
Mm-hmm.
Simply because people have never dealt with the unknown well. This is just a continued theme throughout history, whether it came to technological advancement, natural phenomenons we didn't understand, or anything like that. Fear and suspicion is a common reaction to it. So put it down one bit to, hey, this is a big animal that kind of wants to mind its own business, and two, people wanting to keep to themselves, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I get that. Now, let me go ahead and pick up from here. So, let me go ahead and elaborate. Now, it's our belief here at Seabro that Bigfoot encounters can be largely modeled off of great ape encounters that had happened in Africa before official species recognition. Okay? We were just talking about it before we even hit the record button. Gorillas were cryptids like 100 years ago. Full stop. It's not a lie. It's not crazy. They were 100% wild men, crazy spirit things that hung out in the mountains that looked like humans, and they were giant. And they did all kinds of crazy things. And then whenever the colonial explorers came out there and they bagged one, they brought it back and they were like, no, that's a monkey. Okay, so it's kind of our opinion that this can be modeled largely off of how we discovered gorillas, or how we discovered other major great ape species, okay? So there's a reason why, in my opinion, that certain areas can be considered hotspots, while other places that you would think that they're not hotspots, but they should be, or maybe besides there not being a population in there, maybe we're just not getting in contact with them, okay? And overall, I think this reason is because there's a larger chance for a smaller town that has a small population that wanders over a larger rural area in its daily life to see something than people making one-off trips into the woods, or someone on the outskirts of a city seeing something strange, okay? We believe that these things largely exist outside the range of the majority of daily human travel, and these sightings occur when they are either traveling, looking for an easy food source, or curious about something happening in the area that may be unusual to them, okay? So I say all that because there are hunters out there that go out in the woods and see things. There are fishermen that go out and hikers that go out, and they all see things. But if you look at the percentages of reported sightings to Bigfoot research organizations, the majority of reports are roadside sightings, with the creature moving either across the road or along the highway, okay? They tend to be seen when they put themselves in compromising positions and situations, rather than when they're in their natural habitat, okay? All of these things kind of add up to how we made contact with great apes and how we had to establish relationships with them by gifting and interacting with them and making them familiar with us before they were comfortable enough to let researchers into their territory. And that's how we were able to learn more about the way they lived and how they operated, you know? Now, what people don't see and isn't really brought up in all these documentaries about great apes is the miles hiked, the days spent out in the bush, the months or years of continued diplomacy, for lack of a better word, with these groups of great apes before anything reliable could be shot for the documentary. Okay? Now, I think Bob Gimlin, the YouTuber, brought up as well, if you're looking for a good photo of a Bigfoot and you're wondering why we always get these blurry, crappy photos of a blob squatch, well, just go out to the zoo and try and get a good zoomed in photo of a chimpanzee in its habitat, right? At a good 30, 40 yards away. Your phone has a hard time focusing, especially in windows and seconds of opportunity, right? And that's when we have them in an enclosure. What do you think will happen if you're trying to get good camera footage or good photos of even a bonobo way out there in the woods and he doesn't want you to see him? He's going to try and actively avoid you. So all this starts to line up with great ape behavior. And we've got the records to show that Bigfoot encounters line up with this behavior as well. And this has been going on for hundreds of years, just kind of the same way that the civilizations in Africa interacted with gorillas for thousands of years before they were actually discovered. So that's kind of my answer to that. So go ahead and pass it back to you, Meth.
All right. I have my questions answered on, I have my questions answered on that one. So I'm going to move on to the third question. And the third one is, when learning about Bigfoot in general, what are some things to brush up on and what are some things to avoid? This was a big thing for me specifically because, like I said earlier, when I got into wanting to learn more about Bigfoot and the do's and the don'ts, this was something that I consistently bounced off of Jaster and Kaz. So, like, I'm just going to go ahead and let them take the wheel.
So there are a couple of avenues in regards to that. I'm gonna split them up into kind of three categories here. So the first one is the lore. There are a handful of well-known and iconic stories about Bigfoot that are kind of I wouldn't say like revered and untouchable, but they are definitely worth knowing because they will come up in conversation. And I think one of the best examples of this is the Ape Canyon incident, and everything surrounding that. When we watched that recent Squatch exploitation film, they did a recreation of that whole incident, and me and Jasper were super thrilled about it because depictions of that are always kind of a hit or miss, but they did a fantastic job with it. And the reason why something like Ape Canyon is so important, at least in regards to the conversation of Bigfoot, is that it's a prominent example of hostile Bigfoot activity, which is not that common. You know, you have was allegedly a group of Sasquatches throwing large rocks and possibly even boulders at a cabin, trying to break down a door, busting windows and reaching through them, trying to get at the occupants as retaliation for one of their number getting shot and killed. And it's a bunch of guys locked up in a cabin under siege by things they can't understand, terrified out of their mind, out in the middle of nowhere. That's a really crazy thing to think about. And it's a story that, at least when you look at the context of it, suggests like, hey, there may be some degree of sentience to these creatures. But then you kind of get into the to the larger retelling of the story by somebody who was actually there, and then you start getting into a lot of spiritual bullshit and all sorts of other fun things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also a good example of kind of how to carefully interact with information that has let's say a spiritual slant to it. So me, I always describe myself as a rationalist when it comes to Sasquatch. I generally do not lean into spiritual or, woo like explanations for what it could be. So that means, tree portals, all that, mind speak, all that fun kind of stuff. I don't really buy into that simply because I believe that discussing those kind of things cheapens the topic, and it's part of why stereotype of being a Bigfoot researcher is being crazy people running around the woods making noises.
It's definitely a part of why the scientific community doesn't look at us very well, or in a very well light, you know. But I'll let you back at it.
The second one would be kind of the framework of the hypotheses. I don't want to call it a body of evidence per se because it's all speculation. There are common patterns across the large body of encounters that we have that at this point we generally have a profile of Sasquatch of behaviors that we're pretty confident about. But then there are also a lot of behaviors that we're only just now starting to think, well, maybe there isn't actually as much of this as we think there is. And I think one of the biggest ones that Jasper and I recently kind of started thinking about and really deconstructing was tree structures. A lot of times you'll see people doing field work in active areas, and they'll say, "Oh, look at this thing I found," and it'll basically look like somebody took a bunch of branches, leaned them together, and people say, "Oh, well, obviously a Sasquatch had to have made this," when we don't have any real correlation between the structure existing and a Sasquatch. Like, okay, yes, there is correlation in that this structure appeared in an area where there's Sasquatch activity, but there's no proof of causation. And the burden of proof is kind of something that will always be hanging over whatever you're looking into. So it's important to really be able to think about things from an angle where you can go, well, how does this tie into things? And using kind of a Watson, a Holmesian way of looking at it, where you kind of eliminate every likely explanation. Tree knocks, that's another thing that everybody thought was a Sasquatch thing, but there's still really no, data or anything, any kind of profile that can back that up. And the third and the most important one is that there are certain names you have to know. Obviously, Lauren Coleman is an individual who comes up in discussion a lot because he's a very prominent cryptozoologist of the modern era. Obviously, you have the Four Horsemen that we bring up every now and again from the early days of Bigfoot research. And then there's Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who recently a lot of people have been kind of raising their brows a little bit at his work and really wondering, what all of his motivations were. But, generally me and Jasper tend to, view him as about the closest thing you can get to legitimate, map moneymaker, stuff like that. These are individuals you need to know about because of the work that they do, stuff like that. And for every researcher, obviously there is also the snake oil salesman like Todd Standing, Bob Hieronymus, stuff like that. It's a lot of information to take in because obviously Bigfoot is its own little subculture, and there's a lot of interesting characters that exist within it. And you kind of have, it's unfortunately, kind of a sense that you have to really hone for yourself is, do I feel like this person is being truthful right now? And the question is, you will always find yourself asking every time you read a report or, whenever you read an interview is, what is this person's motivation? Is there financial incentive here? And I wouldn't say it happens all the time. I would say probably there's I don't know, probably 25-30% chance that, somebody who is coming forward might have some kind of incentive for it. So, obviously you want to be wary of people who are on the talk show circuit, who are, frequently getting, media interviews or stuff like that because, now obviously the exception is when, of course, that they are appearing as an expert on a documentary around the topic, then that's like, okay, yeah, then they're being called in for that. But like, follow the money, follow the paperwork is basically what I'm saying. So that's kind of my input on that. What about you, Jasper?
So I'll tackle this kind of more from a modern or what's the word, open source intelligence standpoint. As somebody that goes in there and you just go on the internet or go into the library or go wherever your local bookstore has cryptozoological books in it, right? And you're trying to find new information. How do you figure out what's good, what's not, right? So the landscape today is wildly different than a decade ago, 2 decades ago, pre-internet. We just discussed that, right?
Yeah.
So if you're really wanting to research the phenomenon itself, you need to know how to discern when you're listening to a report that has happened to somebody, or at least that person has complete belief in what had happened to them, and when someone's trying their hand at fiction writing and doesn't want you to know about it, right? That's a growing concern within the community, and it's got a lot of connotations and associations with YouTube, right? Now, that's a hard one to say, is that the platform that we use to get out there and discuss this topic with people has a lot of the misinformation in it, right? And there's a lot of really good people out there that are doing content for the topic and what they're doing, in all honesty, and a lot of them are open and upfront about this, is they're just opening their email and they're getting a report and they're just reading it. They're not asking follow-up questions or anything like that. They're not requiring additional information or evidence. They're just reading it. So there's going to be people trying their hand at fiction writing and trying to see if, when it gets brought up in their episode, if it gets received well or not, right? Now, that sucks because that intentionally muddies the water for us, right? But there's some things to know. And a lot of it has to do with what we like to call flowery prose or descriptive writing, right? If it's getting so in depth that this person is recalling individual flower colors and all that other kind of stuff, let me just put it this way. The chances of there being that many people with a photographic memory seeing Bigfoot is insane, for the amount of reports that you can find out there where the person just remembers every single detail of what happened that day, right, Kaz? Am I crazy on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you gotta worry about those, right? Generally, what we like to look at is concisity, the amount of information in a report that they were trying to get. Generally speaking, if you're looking at a BFRO report and the majority of the information is in the other section, that's kind of a red flag sometimes, because some people do be trying to throw out whole novels in there, and you gotta really look at it and see what's good and what isn't. But like Kaz says, we kind of have our own list of content creators, journalists, researchers, and scientists that we like to listen to, and we keep an eye out for it, right? And that's good and bad. But in order to not really inflame anybody outside of who we've already called out today, I'll keep the rest of that list confidential. You'll have to figure it out by subscribing and liking the channel. You know what I'm saying? I'll go ahead and pass that on to Myth.
All right. I will say that so far, I don't know about you guys in the viewing audience, but I believe they're doing a phenomenal job with knocking these questions out of the park. All right. So we're going to move on to question 4. Why is it that we immediately associate random large animalistic / humanoid sightings as potential Bigfoot sightings? I feel like they've already answered bits and pieces of this, but if they can get a little bit more in depth on the sense of like the animalistic / humanoid sightings part, I feel like we could really touch base on this. So I'm going to pass it to Kaz.
Okay, so we need to discuss the problem of the eyewitness here. This is something you will read about when it comes to forensics. I actually referenced this in a recent episode. I don't remember if it was in the Dogman one or I want to say it was in the Dogman one. But basically, so people generally do not remember details of something super well when they are retelling it. Even the smartest people with greatest recollection will always get something wrong. And while might tell you a generalization of what happened, it's not going to be a one-for-one retelling. And I think one thing I point to a lot when it comes to this is an experiment that was ran in Central Park in New York City. They got a group of, I think about 50 people, and they all stood them in a circle. And in the middle of that circle, they staged a robbery. They had somebody steal a purse and run off. And then immediately afterwards, they sat all these people down and processed them for an eyewitness report. And the data that they found was extremely spread out and inconsistent. There was a cluster of people who generally, for the most part, got the characteristics of the burglar down, but then they got the, order of events wrong. Or maybe there were people who got the order of events right, but were just way off of how the robber looked. And what came to be observed from this is that, eyewitness reports are not the end-all be-all of any kind of investigation, and what you really need is a good body of evidence to set up the narrative that you are trying to follow. And that is now where we get into the big problem with eyewitness reports, which is misidentification. So first off, we've already mentioned how a lot of these sightings take place at roadsides, and generally places where our, air quotes, our world intersect with, air quotes, their world. I know that's not the best, most factual way to put it, but just for the sake of keeping the conversation going, we're going to phrase it like that. Now, think about the average person's experience with wild animals, okay? And while we all generally pride ourselves and go, oh yeah, of course I know what a bear is, or a wolf is, or a moose is, or, whatever this wild animal may be, do you know them well enough to be able to recognize them at a distance with foliage covering them? Do you know them well enough to recognize them in low light? Do you know them well enough to recognize them after only seeing them for a scant few seconds? No, of course you don't, because maybe you live in the city, or you don't have experience with these kind of animals because, that's just kind of the nature of the way you live, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what this causes is there is a certain amount of, chaff that needs to be weeded out, because there are encounters that actually are, this person saw a large animal and misidentified it. This person may just be imagining it. This person might have just seen somebody walking through the woods, and because of the circumstances, may have assumed, oh, this was a Bigfoot. The reason why so many different kinds of sightings can be seen as potential Bigfoot sightings is basically because of human error, is the best way I can explain it. And that is why it takes so much vigilance and real discernment when you're reading reports and you're listening to people, is you have to be able to tell, because it doesn't, they can be the most competent person in the world when they retell their encounter, but you really have to listen to their emotions when they retell it, and stuff like that. And the problem with listening to emotions and looking at body language is that those are not end-all, be-all signifiers of a person's truthfulness at all. Because the fact of the matter is, body language is not a universal thing. While there are general gestures that we might perform, that, can generally indicate something, for example, somebody hugging their arm to themselves might mean they're uncomfortable. That doesn't mean that everybody is going to do that. And different people express that in different ways. So while, somebody might do it just because they're uncomfortable, somebody might do it just because they are comfortable doing that. And so now all of a sudden this casts doubts on any observations you made while they were doing that, because you assumed that this was how they felt or what they meant. And to basically wrap it all up nicely, in a bow. Not only are we dealing with something we have no solid body of evidence, but we are also dealing with one of the most human things of all, um, the chaotic nature of the human mind.
I gotcha. So I'll go ahead. I'll pick up the bat for the Bigfoot like people out there that are like, you know what? I know what I saw. I know what a bear looks like. That wasn't no bear. I know what a moose looks like. That wasn't no moose. You know what I mean? Because there's always going to be people on both sides of this observation, right? And I want to be fair to Kaz as well. There are plenty of these encounters that whenever Bigfoot researchers go out there and they look at the evidence and they look at the area and they try to do recreations of sight and size comparison, line of sight, and all that stuff, they end up throwing out reports as well, right? Like, hey, ma'am, I think you're seeing a bear. I think this Bigfoot print is actually a bear print because it's got the claws in it right in the middle, right? It's just something they were able to find and point out. It's nothing necessarily like these people that are turning in their reports to these organizations are being actively malicious. I think a lot of times it's like, hey, I don't know what I seen, and I don't know if I can go to the cops about this because then I look crazy, so I want to go to the Bigfoot people about it, right? That's okay. So for the people out there that were like, I know whatever I seen wasn't a bear, right? Let me answer this with another question, okay? What else is there in the lexicon of human information to compare a Bigfoot to, right? If you walked out there in the middle of the woods and you saw a 9 foot tall, hairy human thing or hairy monkey looking thing walking bipedally down the woods and just kind of looked at you and then just walked on by and then didn't pay you no attention, like how does your brain process that, right? Like, how do you make sense of what you had just seen? And how would I find the most rational way of communicating this to another person, right? And I think that's really where the majority of weird things that happen to people out in the woods get lumped in as Bigfoot sightings, okay? Because I'll give another one to Cass here. Whenever you get a active trapping area where there's a lot of trappers out doing live bait traps or doing any sort of claw traps or foot pad traps where they can potentially hurt the animal, you start getting more sightings of bears walking around on 2 legs, okay? And it's because they have semi or really permanent damage to their hands because they got caught in a trap and they got out. And they end up walking on 2 legs as a coping mechanism for not having full access to their paws. Now, the next step to that is, well, do they walk the same way as a Bigfoot does? Because I'm pretty sure the way that thing walked, I've never seen anything in the woods move like that. Well, no, not really. That's kind of where this argument falls apart a little bit. Is misidentification can only go so far whenever the clarity of what somebody had seen really defies explanation, at least conventionally speaking. Now, like I said before, Bigfoot always seemed to be moving strangely, at least compared to bears, moose, elk, wolves, big cats, most known primates, right? The gait of Bigfoot is also very strange compared to any of those things that I just described in the woods, right? So if something was moving through the woods looking like that, you'd probably be like, I ain't never seen before. Huh. The closest known animals we know that move like Bigfoot do are gorillas and humans. But they're still distinct enough in their own form of locomotion that we can tell that apart. That's kind of what makes this whole thing weird. And that's kind of why the misidentification thing to me kind of, it's a 60-40 one for me. Is I know people definitely have weird things happen to them in the woods, and weird by definition of it's never happened to them before, and they have no bank of information to reference this off of, so they're going to label this under weird thing that happened to me that's never happened before. But also, you got to at least acknowledge that there are enough seasoned outdoorsmen out there that know what they see on a daily basis and can recognize when they are seeing something that doesn't align with what they normally see, right? So that's kind of what I got to say on that one. So what do you think, Myth? I think this one was a more complicated question.
I think that when going into the realm of what we're talking about in specific or in conjunction with the question, there's so many different things that can lead us to believe a plethora of different things. I'm not going to lean too deeply into it. What I'll say is this: your mind is known to play tricks on you when you become afraid or on alert for something that might or might not be what you speculate it to be. So, more often than not, we're going to lean into what our own most present minded part of realization is at that moment. And it could be something that is truly not. It could be a hallucination. It could be a misidentification. It could be a number of different things. And speaking of like misidentifying and misinforming, we're going to go into the next question. Why is there so much misinformation behind this topic?
Okay, so this is another one of those complex questions that I'm going to do my best to kind of walk you through. And the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that cryptozoology and Bigfooting in and of itself is an informal research topic. There are no degrees you can get in cryptozoology. There is no school of cryptozoology. You know, by nature, it is primarily a amateur
Venture?
amateur venture. And so what that results in is that, you know, you have a lot of people who have the enthusiasm but not the methodology. And, you know, everybody who goes out there looking for it has a different approach of how they're going to do that. And that also comes down to how they gather information and how they organize that and how they quantify it. And so what this results in is you have something that does happen in a scholarly setting where there are a myriad of perspectives on the topic, but the problem is that you don't have that kind of function of being able to disseminate these and distill them into something that can be picked apart and analyzed. So what happens is you have people who will go out and jump at literally any shadow they see and go, all right, well, here's some evidence. One of my things I laugh at the most and also frustrates me is there are people who go out in the woods and will just take pictures of foliage and then they'll let the pareidolia get the better of them, and then they'll start saying, all right, well, here's 3 Bigfoots cloaking, and I'm going to put a red circle here so you can see it, and then you're looking at it and it's just a bunch of trees. And then you have people like us who try to go about things from a more rational and analytical perspective. Like Jaster likes to do his audio analysis. I like to do, literary research in folklore research and see if there's any way I can really tie things into what we're looking at. And while we do our best to maintain some kind of standard here, the fact of the matter is that realistically, there is no one unified standard of researching Bigfoot. And while there are commonly used methods of looking for it, there are commonly, for instance, casting footprints, doing calls, stuff like, trail cameras, stuff like that. Because it's not really an established school of science or research, there's no way to really unify this effort and to really hone it and make it into something better. So as a result, you have people who submit anything that they think of worth, regardless of its actual true worth. And so what that does is it creates a lot of noise because it's the layman doing research. There's nobody here with research grants. There's nobody here, with funding for, good equipment. Everybody does this out of their own pocket. and everybody's doing this on their own time. And while there is plenty of passion to go around and more than enough enthusiasm in terms of practical experience, practical application, it's often lacking for. And then on top of that, you have people who take it beyond what is just simply, kind of a hobby, or which is really how I look at Bigfooting and cryptozoology. It's a hobby. And there are people who look at it from a more spiritual angle and may even be religious about it. And that's when you get into your fluties. And that has its own problem, because now you have these people saying that, they cohabitate with a group of Sasquatches and they talk with them every day and they're feeding them and they have all sorts of proof, but they can't show it to you for this or that reason or whatever. So now you also have this going in. Like, imagine, for instance, if we treated squirrels the same way we knew Bigfoot. If somebody said, I have a colony of squirrels living in my house, and I have names for all of them, and they talk to me every day and tell me about their daily lives, you look at them like they're crazy. The same thing goes for Bigfoot. And that's kind of really... And then there's also the fact that because this has only become a real topic of interest in the last 6 or so decades, there's also the fact that, in terms of a body of documentation and reliable sources, that's only something that people are really starting to try to establish in recent years. And so while we have these big repositories of sightings and, there are these topics that we can kind of centralize discussion around, the fact of the matter is that the infrastructure simply is not there. And because of that, it's anything goes.
Yep. And do you want me to get into the part that I think we all want to talk about?
Yeah, go ahead.
So that happens, and then you get into the government interference camp, right? Where a lot of people, for one reason or another, like to believe that the government either has information and isn't sharing it, or actively knows about it and is actively keeping it out of people's hands, right? There's a few content creators that have made their entire platform off of that, okay? Now, here's the big thing. While these people sound nuts, okay, we've done our own research and we've got also some receipts to prove that the government has pondered the question, what do we do if they found a Bigfoot? But also that there is financial reasons for the government to downplay evidence. You don't want to lose tons of money in grants or licenses for logging, for people going out to the state parks, for the kids. You don't want to lose all that money. Now, let's kick this around to a adjacent camp, right? We know now that the UFO community has been dealing with active misinformation spreading by the government for decades, since at least the 70s, okay? That's crazy. And that's a part of the documentation that's been coming out over the last couple of years, right? That everybody that's read into the program actively knows that there are active disinformation campaigns going on within the United States about UFO disclosure. If they're willing to do that with UFOs, okay? And we're talking about $1 million a year or millions of dollars a year research in retail industry, logging industry, farming and tourism industries. Guess what? They might or probably are already engaged in the exact same behavior, because a lot of the motivations line up and are the same, right? But that's all conjecture. The other thing that I want to talk about is, what about the people in our own community, right? That get up on the soapbox every day and talk about how, like Kaz said, they are either in contact with Bigfoot or they're actively researching them. And then you get goofy videos about, 15 feet away from a Bigfoot or what looks to be something resembling a Bigfoot. And then they pass it off as evidence, right? That's a problem. What about the people that are fabricating their evidence in order to get their name out there so they can sell you camping trips or hunting guides or t-shirts? You know what I mean? Like, there's so many people in the game that are just trying to make money. And for them, being able to say, hey, I actively have encounters, listen to me, I know about these things, I'm experiencing it right now, is a good way for them to get people to their shop to spend money, right? That's another thing that hurts us. Because as Kaz said, this conversation can't move forward scientifically with all of the mud in the water. And that's the hard part. And then that kind of goes back to what you guys, or what we were all talking about before. What do we do? How do we look at information in order to say, hey, is this good or is it not? And that's why we keep that list that we were talking about before of people we just don't listen to because it's just not good. And even if they do have a legitimate account, it's almost guaranteed that it's embellished. So it's probably better just to not listen, right? But I'll go ahead and throw that back to Myth, okay?
All right. This will be our final question for this episode. So buckle up. What is the beast of Whitehall and why is it such an impactful and important piece of the lore of Bigfoot?
Okay, so my commentary on this one is going to be brief because this is actually a case that I actually hadn't heard about until you brought it up, which is kind of incredible to me given the nature of it. So, talking about the nature of sightings, there are certain elements that me and Jaster really like because it lends to more credibility. And typically what we like the most is sightings that have law enforcement officers present, members of the military, members of government organizations, or anything of that nature, because it gives it an extra bit of credibility because they have something to lose by coming forward with these sightings. They have, because it's very easy to get blacklisted in your police department or your branch of the military or, you know, your office or whatever, because you came out and you said, hey, I saw a big hairy ape man. It ruins the you know, believability of you and your position. You know, I mentioned earlier that there are people who have these encounters and don't want to come forward about them, and this is one of the reasons why. Is they're you know, for it, you know, it's a stigma. Just because it's more acceptable to talk about Sasquatch and have that conversation now doesn't mean that it still doesn't pose a risk to your professional life. And so the Beast of Whitehall is important because, well, yes, the initial sighting is by a group of teenagers. They found a law enforcement officer, and then he called backup out there. And while this was all happening, all three of these groups saw this individual. And while they all kind of agreed to themselves that none of them were going to bring it up until, you know, they were retired and not come forward, the story was out there for a long time, and now we have names we can tie to that. There are careers we can tie to that, which make this not only something that we can, you know, root down and say, yeah, we have, you know, there is a body of evidence to this in regards to the veracity of these eyewitnesses' reports, but it also sets it apart because those are circumstances that don't happen that often. Most of your Sasquatch encounters are by civilians. So when, you know, typically hunters, hikers, stuff like motorists. So when you have an instance of law enforcement or anything like that, that's when you want to sit forward and listen, because they've made the conscious choice to come forward and talk about it, despite the fact that they have, you know, they have skin in the game. There are stakes to what they're saying. And that's why the Beast of Whitehall is important. Now I'm going to pass the baton to Jaster.
You guys had said most of what I wanted to say on that. So, the Beast of Whitehall, or for some other people that know it by the Beast of Adair Road, ended up being basically the crowning observation of Bigfoot in what is now known as probably New York's biggest Bigfoot hotspot. Okay, it's also a place that we had visited kind of recently on the show in Missing in Bigfoot Country with Tom Messick, right? Turns out Tom Messick went missing not too far away from where the Beast of Adair Road was spotted in the grand scheme of things, right? It was just, I don't know, 30, 40 years apart. And there are tons of sightings in that area. Now, the part that I want to really harp on and what Kaz brought out is that, you know how we were just talking about how in court witness testimony doesn't normally stand up that hard, right? That's kind of, unless you're like one of these things that they like to call a mandated observer, right? That is essentially a person that an organization or a government believes what they say because they have been trained to observe and record this information either mentally or physically for recollection at a later date, right? It's also people that are supposed to make reports when things happen as they happen. Those are kind of things like, you know, teachers, firefighters, EMS, law enforcement, all that other kind of stuff. That all qualifies as a mandated observer, right? The other thing that I think is really big is that 3 different police precincts or jurisdictions converged on this sighting, right? We had the original police officer that was contacted by the kids after they had seen the Bigfoot, right? But he also made the call, hey, this is really close to the county line, so I'm going to call in and just say, hey, I'm responding to a possible vagrant or something to that effect, and just request some additional support just so that way if something does happen, there's no jurisdiction issues, right? Which was really smart on the police officer's part, but not for the reason he thought. He thought he might have been dealing with some sort of person that was dangerous or needed to be brought in. So he needed to process this individual quickly, and they needed to get the takedown on it rather than wait for another precinct to show up, right? Well, while they were all out there looking around, and they were like, that's where we seen him at, over there, they look over, and there he is again. So they had 3 kids and 3 police officers all see Bigfoot at the same time. And then, like Kaz said, the police officers said, hey, guys, we're not going to release our names or anything like that because we want to actually enjoy our careers as policemen, but whenever we retire, we will come forward. And then one of them did. And so now we actually have the corroboration where the original witnesses were like, yes, this is actually one of the police officers that came that night, right? He was the original police officer that they stopped and talked to originally. And he came forward, at least to the best of my knowledge. I'm 99% confident that's true. But now we've got it on both sides. Like, hey, I'm a retired police officer. I said back when this happened that I would speak out about this when I retired. Guess what? It's retirement time, so here we go. Let's talk about Bigfoot, y'all. And his encounter to this day still stands up. It's not like he changed his story over the last 30 years. It's another one of those situations where as the report gets older, there's a lot of opportunities for it to fall apart because either the witness starts changing their story or the evidence gets disputed or contradictory evidence comes out, right? But this is one of those cases where over the last, let's say 55 years, around that time frame, the story has stayed the same. Now, there's another currently debated piece of evidence that has similarly stood the test of time, and that's the Patterson-Gimlin film. But we'll see how that plays out when the documentary comes out, right? We'll still see. I saw that the IMDb has already gotten like a 6.6 out of 10 because it still hasn't came out, and everybody's like, where is this movie? But whatever. The thing that makes that story and that narrative just as compelling is that the people that surrounded the film, like Bob Gimlin, has never changed his story. And there were multiple people that day to back it up. They've got some amount of evidence. At least with the Beast of Adair Road, What kind of sucks is that they didn't have physical evidence for what they had seen that day, but what they did have are 3 different police officers and then 3 civilians that all saw the same thing at the same time, and they were all telling you the same thing. It wasn't like that game of telephone. It wasn't like that social experiment we talked about earlier in the episode where everybody saw a different guy mug this person for their purse, right? No, all these guys were like, hey, I mean, the heights were a little bit varied and different from what I understand, but it's the same thing. They all saw the same thing happen, and it stayed the same to this day. And I think that brings a lot of weight to that encounter, right? Not just the fact that there were police officers involved, but the fact that the narrative has never changed. There's never been any contradictory evidence. And most importantly, let's bring this out there, the police departments involved never actually told these guys that they're crazy. None of these guys went out on the news and said, my cops are smoking reefer, right? None of them did that. None of them threw these officers under the bus. They all waited until they were retired. They let them do their piece and they let them go home. If they thought these dudes were crazy, I feel like it would have came out at some point. But I'll go ahead and throw that one back to Myth because I think I made my point with that one.
I believe that at this point, I will leave the guessing up to you, our viewing audience. Whatever your assumption as to what the reality of these things are, I would like for you to comment down below in the comment section. And remember, we are always interested in what you have to say. And we would love for you to try to pick our brains on any topic that you have. We may not get back to you immediately, but we will. And I think this was a great first episode.
Absolutely. So if you guys have any questions that you want included in a episode 2, go ahead and throw them in the comments section below. Let's go ahead and bring this full circle. If you are new to the Bigfoot discussion and you have a question that you want us to answer on the show, just throw it down below. We'll get to it. And we'll keep bringing this up. We'll get through this as best we can. And let's all grow together as a community, answer each other's questions, and hopefully we all learn some stuff along the way, right? That's the best part. Now, if you liked anything you'd seen today, or if you made it this far, consider giving us a like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. You know, that helps us out. But most importantly, share us with some of your other friends that might take this topic a little more seriously, or send us to a skeptic friend of yours and see if this has anything to sway him or her one way or another. But that's all for us tonight. My name is Jaster with the Southeast Bigfoot Research Organization, and you all have a wonderful night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.